With another video. This video is going to be about how Manchester United ended Manchester City's winning run in the Premier League today. And please subscribe and like the video before we start. It's made using keyframe, so check out the description below. And I'm going to add a little link to a diagram I made of just Manchester City's structural formations moving through the thirds of the field. So there'll be a link in the bio a couple hours after I post this video, so be on the lookout for that, and let's get right into it. So I wanted to start with the Manchester United build-up, and they built out of the back using Dean Henderson splitting the two central defenders and the fullbacks relatively deeper. And what this did was it forced Manchester City midfielders, players like Sterling and Mahrez, to go a further distance away to go and press these wide players. And in Mahrez's case, he'd have to press Maguire while also worrying about Luke Shaw when the two forwards were committed into the pressing shape. And from Manchester United's point of view, they would try and attract the press from Manchester City, which is they did this through a first line pass in the initial action of the build-up, and this drew the Manchester City players out. So it would draw players like Kevin De Bruyne out to go and press using his cover shadow to block out the middle, and Gabriel Jesus would then follow suit after the ball was played back to Dean Henderson. And what this would do, especially to players like Mahrez, when they would go and press, this would then create the possibility for Manchester United to play mid-range passes and take advantage of the overstretched Manchester City press. And this was crucial for Manchester United to take advantage of their qualitative superiority in the front three and through Bruno Fernandes to then play through the space in a more vertical fashion. So as we see, Kevin De Bruyne, he's pressing the ball at the moment. He had jumped to then press to one side using his cover shadow to block the narrow pass into the double pivot so they wouldn't be broken through the center. And with Kevin De Bruyne pressing, Gundogan jumps to hold this vertical connection relatively stable. And while this happens, Mahrez is also just creeping forward, generating access to Maguire to then press and win the ball in a more advantageous position closer to goal. And Gabriel Jesus holds his position, still occupying the double pivot, so there's less of a chance to be broken through the center. But what this does is it allows Luke Shaw to then become open and play for a mid-range pass, breaking the press of Manchester City. So now when the press was broken, we'd have the free player Bruno Fernandes between the lines, and as we see Martial, he was taking care of the two central defenders who were very oriented towards him. So as we see, just John Stones jumping to maintain man orientation to Anthony Martial while Diaz is protecting him behind, and then this leaves the fullbacks relatively isolated with Rashford and Daniel James to use their pace in behind. And we can see Manchester City, their press is broken. We can't see Mahrez in the picture, so we just see these five midfielders just broken, and now the press can go further forward. Both half spaces are relatively vacated after the initial press is broke, and this allows for diagonal runs, passes in behind, and more vertical actions. Now we see a stretched look from the second half. The same setup but a better view. We have our back three, Dean Henderson splitting the two central defenders, a staggered double pivot which attracts midfielders further forward and forces Gabriel Jesus to use his cover shadow. And in this situation we see more of a 4-3-3, but Manchester City often switch to a 4-4-2. And then we see the key dynamics of the game. One, the Luke Shaw, the free player in the wide area, and we just see how overstretched Mahrez is in this position where he has to maintain access, one to Maguire and Luke Shaw. But we see the distance between him and Luke Shaw. It's quite a far way away, while his orientation is bringing him forward. So this allows Luke Shaw to become free. And so when he's able to find the ball, we then have a broken Manchester City shape, and we have 1v1s in each of the wide areas, which allows them to make more goal-oriented diagonal runs and Martial through the center. And now, last picture of the build-up, just starting with Manchester United because they won the match. We have a three-man build-up, stagger, double pivot, creating different reference points for the midfielders. So when Gabriel Jesus, when he jumps to go and press, Gundogan also has to jump from a deeper position to maintain this access to the player further forward, and it sets the tone of the press with these orientations and who triggers to press when. Now Manchester City in their build-up phase, we had a few different rotations we had to keep an eye on, mostly concerning the back four, but also with De Bruyne coming into the team, his tendency to drift into wide areas to try and create space for himself and create options diagonally to play through Manchester United's team. But we had pretty much a 4-2-3-1 from Manchester United. Their wingers did a very good job about using their cover shadows to block access to the central three corridors, and Bruno Fernandes also doing a job to prevent easy access to the double pivot of Manchester City. But with the first rotation we see here, in the initial build-up is Cancelo, goes a bit higher and more narrow, joining as a double pivot or playing more as an inside 8, box-to-box midfielder, if you want to call it that. And now we have Zinchenko holding the wide area, holding the width of the team, using asymmetry because on the side with Zinchenko, in the initial third of build-up, they'll use double width, freeing up some movement from Sterling and creating double width just for a little more flexibility. And as we move forward, Zinchenko will become a third central defender a lot of the time. So here we are again with our back three, Ederson, creating the back three, our double pivot, and now Gabriel Jesus, one of his tendencies was to come deeper, and this usually was in response to De Bruyne moving from his half space position into the wide area to now take advantage of Rashford, who is looking to go out and press the wide central defender. So if Rashford would go out and press the wide central defender, this would create the opportunity for the space to be with De Bruyne in the wide area, or it could create kind of a ripple effect if now all of a sudden Fred would go out to then press Kevin De Bruyne. The space would then be through the center of the field. So keeping that in mind, Manchester United trying to exploit the space, and Manchester United trying to stay compact to prevent Manchester City from using this space. And we can see the distance between the double pivot of Manchester United and their orientation was slightly man orientation, but with the space in mind, using their cover shadows a lot of the time to prevent access through the center of the field. And the asymmetry in the initial third of build-up from Manchester City, as we see both half spaces are used and now the wide area. So they have, and the central corridor is easily accessible, giving them options to change the dynamics of the pass when they're building out from the back. And now if we highlight the midfield shape, we often see a 2-3 situation in Manchester City's midfield with a double pivot and then 3 offensive players. And we see the dynamics of this change with De Bruyne coming in with his tendency to drift wider and then spark more movement through the center to try and stretch the Manchester United connections in the midfield. So now Looking at the build-up again in the first third of the field. Stones in the wide area, Ederson splitting the two central defenders. We have asymmetry with Stones wide area, Ederson central corridor, and Diaz through the half space. The double pivot created by the inverted fullback. And now we see the first tendency when United go to press. The weak side player. Here Bruno Fernandes, Daniel James is a little bit deeper. They're coming over to then close off the double pivot as we see Fred jumping. But so now we can't see Daniel James in the picture because he's dropped in, creating connections with Scott McTominay, allowing for more horizontal shifting in the wider area. So from here, Manchester United would look to isolate possession and force the pass either down the line or force them to then go backwards where there is no space. But being able to force John Stones to play a vertical pass in the wide area is a benefit to the defenders because they have a more dynamic advantage, and the player receiving the ball has a very poor field of view in this situation. So now moving into the midfield third, we can discuss a few tendencies. So again, asymmetry used through Zinchenko, the double pivot, positioning themselves between central defenders. And one of the tendencies we must note when looking at Manchester City's build-up in the midfield third is the tendency for the two central midfielders or the double pivot to then position themselves deeper between central defenders. So especially Rodri would do this. He would oftentimes start deeper, and then this would open up space in the half space for then him to use a dynamic movement or dynamic jumping action to then access this space with forward momentum. So something taken probably from Atalanta, because their teams do this a lot, but also something just to note. And we have their structure further forward with De Bruyne and Gundogan. Gundogan again using the wide movement as De Bruyne would, moving into the wide area to then try and pull out Scott McTominay, allowing for space between the lines for a player like Gabriel Jesus to come in from a false nine position. So moving forward from here, we have Gundogan. Then another movement is a vertical movement through the half space between two defenders. This pushes their back four deeper. Their back four is well connected, good distances between them, and a good line. But this movement from Gundogan further forward would look to free up Sterling to give him time and space to then turn and run with the ball. Because of the distance between the Manchester United double pivot, it was smart to go with McTominay and Fred because of their athleticism and their ability to cover ground. So oftentimes this would be unsuccessful for Manchester City because of the willingness from Manchester United's double pivot to shift into the wide areas, use their cover shadow to block any entry passes into the midfield, and the willingness of players like Rashford to drop deeper in line with the midfielders and Bruno Fernandes staying switched on in these situations to also not let circulation become available through Rodri. So now, a few more dynamics here, and this is going to focus on the Manchester City. We start to see their rest defense shape with both wide central defenders in the build-up phase at least, coming into the half space, moving more in line with Rodri, leaving Diaz as the player who's deepest as circulation and cover in behind. This put the Manchester City defensive three players closer to proximity to then match up and counter press the Manchester United outlets, especially Bruno Fernandes. But in terms of circulation, having access in both half spaces and playing a little bit wider in the half spaces just creates the dynamic option to then play into the midfield using diagonal passing options just slightly rather than a vertical passing option. Just makes it a little bit more efficient. And with Cancelo moving higher, they also have the new dynamic of being able to use Gabriel Jesus to pin two of the back four players depending on his situation. So with here, Manchester City creating numerical superiority through Gundogan and Cancelo against the 2-versus-1 versus Fred. But again, Manchester United created good positionings through their 3 attacking midfielders or their 10 and their 2 wingers because of their use of the cover shadows to force the ball into wide positions, which is then where they would try and trap it and isolate it, which prevented Manchester City from being able to take advantage of this numerical superiority and the athleticism from Fred and McTominay to be able to cover more ground effectively to then prevent this use of numerical superiority. So from here, we can take a look at the wide area. Manchester City have the ball through Zinchenko, the double pivot, and now we see again De Bruyne, Jesus, Gundogan making a run higher up the field to then try and drag out McTominay or pin the back four in a more deep position to allow a player like Sterling time and space on the ball to receive. But as we talked about, McTominay and Fred were more willing to run into these wide areas and shift across to prevent access to a free player and then space in behind. So the double pivot and the narrow wingers also prevented Manchester City from playing into central areas. As we see here, their spatial control around the double pivot and their higher line created a high level of vertical compactness, making it very difficult for Manchester City to play between the lines or even circulate through their double pivot to then get to the weak side through Mahrez. Here's just a situation of Rodri, an example of how he has the tendency to use the asymmetry in the Manchester City team. We have our 4-man midfield occupying advanced areas in the platform, but the focus here is on Rodri and his tendency to come deeper through the field. Even if he wouldn't receive this pass, even if it would just skip him, he would then create the dynamic of being unmarked, able to then jump further forward. And we see now De Bruyne just fading away as the ball starts to circulate. De Bruyne just coming into the wider area here to try and take advantage, get away from Fred, or force Fred to follow him to open up space for Gabriel Jesus. So from here, we see the Manchester United press and how organized they were, with Fred willing to jump in the wide area, Rashford, Martial, all isolating possession, with Bruno Fernandes as the 10, tracking Cancelo on the near side, and this creates a high level of diagonal compactness and spatial control, which isolates the ball. And Manchester City from here would look to then use their numerical superiority through the half space further up the field, as we might see this space being highlighted between the lines. So Manchester City looking for this diagonal passing option, entering a more narrow position in the half space, but with this press inviting Manchester United further forward, and with the positioning of De Bruyne, this would oftentimes, even if progression wasn't protected from Manchester United, they'd have good players around the ball, tight connections to where they'd be able to recover from even a broken shape in the defensive phase. So we see here Mahrez then moving on the inside, complementing De Bruyne's movement into the wide area. Now Fred is dropped out of the central corridors, and I'm just going to highlight the distance between holding midfielders and the willingness for these players to move into wider areas and their commitment to controlling the more advanced players who typically occupy the half spaces. So this distance is pretty incredible and shows the man orientation aspect, and when Manchester United would go and press, that would be their main concern. But also the tightness of Shaw on Mahrez, and then following the man orientation of Bruno Fernandes, so that the third man concept wouldn't be devastating, because if the initial press is broken, then you essentially have Manchester City players running at Man U's back line and then creating a numerical superiority going forward. But oftentimes these situations would usually end up in just recirculation or Manchester United recovering. So the last picture from Manchester City now, at least in the midfield third, we see the asymmetry again. Now the double pivot was subject to change, and a couple times the players through Gundogan and Cancelo would then start deeper to then pull out the Manchester United central players through the midfield a little bit further to then create space to then move into and create space for more advanced players like De Bruyne and Jesus to then access. But again, we can just look, both wingers are caught on one side because of the transition. The double pivot from Manchester United are still there, and then their shape, through their fluidity, they were easily able for Martial to then just move into the wider area while still staying narrow, controlling the central corridors and creating access to multiple players. So now, in the last, against Manchester United's low block, we would see Zinchenko join the midfield line a bit higher, and Stones, when he would receive the ball, he would take the ball higher as well into the half space a little bit wider, which would put them in close proximity to Rodri as the holding midfielder and put them close proximity to the outlets of Manchester United, trying to establish a more relevant counter-pressing rest defense, as well as putting them in closer proximity to their players further forward, as we see here. And interesting enough, sometimes the Manchester United defenders like Aaron Wan-Bissaka would then cheat a little bit and put himself in closer proximity to Cancelo, as well as splitting his access in behind as well, which is a bit dangerous by jumping in this area because of the range of passing, but it worked out well, and that's the tactic they used. So that was pretty much the analysis. I hope everyone enjoyed it. So I'll see you in the next one.